So here's something interesting. I'm sure you've all seen this video.
Mr. President, so on Truth Social, you said that you were going to cut aid from South Africa. Will you plan to cut aid across other African nations, and why South Africa?
No, it's only South Africa. Terrible things are happening in South Africa. The leadership is doing some terrible things, horrible things. So that's under investigation right now. We'll make a determination. And until such time as we find out what South Africa is doing, they're taking away land, they're confiscating land, and actually they're doing things that are perhaps far worse than that.
Now, for those that might likely click away from this video and not get to the end or even get the gist of it, let's address the Donald Trump comments quick, just for your benefit. It's going to be important for you to understand that Donald Trump has been lied to for a long time now by AfriForum and other right-wing machinery organizations. He's been lied to around land expropriation in South Africa, what it is and what it isn't. The South African government is not repossessing, dispossessing, or confiscating land from certain classes of people. This is just a lie. And if you have evidence of this, direct us, give us links in the comments. I really implore you to watch this piece to the end because there are a lot of things that make up this conversation in particular. And I don't want us to let this go without giving it a fair and proper shot. No matter how angry and marginalized you're feeling right now, please keep going and watch this video until the end. Now, other than the AfriForum right-wing misinformation machine running at full tilt around this particular thing, the wheels are likely to come off anytime soon, by the way. What I think we should deal with in this video, which might actually be a series, at least we need to just deal with the land question and South Africa and get into the nuts and bolts of who owns what and what we can do to move forward and fix the clear injustices of this. The AfriForum, Elon, Silicon Valley right-wing groups and their seemingly endless amount of money and global connections, they pose a danger to South Africa, amongst other issues. Issues that likely deserve their own video, but however, to me at least, their actions will inadvertently unite black and white people in at least piercing the veil on non-racialism in this country. And this will make it clear that racist actions and propaganda in South Africa is still very much well and truly around. That video we'll get to at a later stage. I don't want to make this more complex than what it actually is. It needs to be simple. Now, the other thing that must be said is that America is looking after its own interests, as well as them reserving the right to not fund anyone or any other state. We should do the same. We should look after our own interests. The fact that we have relied on US funding for things like PEPFAR and other health as well as social programs creates this illusion that we are beggars for foreign aid. But this is happening because our government has become complacent and they've just accepted this aid money and they've accepted that it would come with no strings attached. This was a lie. We need to clearly fix our budgets. We're not beggars. And it's our government that has made us look like beggars. We're not perfect, not by a long shot, but we're not paupers. We, however, do and always will want to engage with any and all nations that want to facilitate clear, mutually beneficial, and straightforward trade as well as social relations with us as South Africa. This has always been our stance as a country. Okay, let's get to this land question. Context is very important. And firstly, we need to all understand that South Africa is born from a long and very unequal history of colonialism and apartheid, which still plays a major role in ownership issues till this day. The indigenous people, like the Khoi, the San, and even the Bantu-speaking groups, were here before European settlers, no matter what other people try to tell you. Then enter the Portuguese explorers, the Dutch, and the British colonizers. They get into this area, taking and sometimes, to a lesser extent, buying land from natives. Now, whether those transactions were fair or not is for somebody else to unpack. To me, I don't think so. Under apartheid, which started in 1948, and even before that, laws legislatively disadvantaged non-white groupings in this country. This is a fact and not my opinion. Laws like the Native Land Act of 1913, guys, which restricted black people from owning land in most of this country. This is another fact. Now, this led to forced removals and the creation of the Bantu homelands. Now, after apartheid ended in 1994, the ANC-led government wanted to address these injustices through land reform. But that process was and still is very slow for anyone's liking. It's also complicated, and that's what's frustrated many. This must be placed entirely at the government's fault. Land reform in South Africa has three parts: restitution, retribution, and tenure reform. Restitution is about returning land taken after 1913. Redistribution is transferring land to disadvantaged groups, and tenure is about dealing with people's legal rights to land. This is clearly expressed and has always been clearly stated by each successive government since 1994 through words and actions, and sometimes even inactions. We must not fall prey to fabricated minority propaganda. Let's deal in facts and figures and find a way forward. In fact, let's get into this Land Act. Now, the new expropriation law outlines exactly how expropriation can be done and under what basis government can take land for public interest. It's also important to say that this new law, which went through public commentary, replaces the Apartheid Expropriation Act of 1975, which placed an obligation on the state to pay owners whatever it wanted for taking the land, doing that under a willing seller, willing buyer principle. The new South African land law allows for expropriation without compensation only in circumstances where it is just and equitable to do so and in the public interest. This new law also speaks to property that is not being used, where there's a clear scenario where there is no intention to either develop or to make money from holding this land, or when the land poses a risk to people. Think of a scenario where people are building in floodplains like in Alex, where it always just rains and they live next to rivers, which they shouldn't be doing, and it floods a lot there. That's clearly dangerous. Or even places that are important to government like national key points. This is the truth around the law, as per the Constitution. The new Land Expropriation Bill will allow for the state to expropriate land in a non-chaotic manner for public interest or for public purposes. For example, to build mass social housing, the construction of things like roads and even other public and economic infrastructure. For example, this is what was done in the likes of the Gautrain. Under the law, the state may not expropriate arbitrarily or for a purpose other than in the public interest, which they have to prove in court. Now, for all of the noise in the media and even the spectacular irony, wrap your head around this one. The Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution, where it pertains to private property, actually prohibits the US government from taking property without just compensation. But they also can, under the grounds of public interest, take that same land, which is the same as here in South Africa. That's what the government's trying to do. Now, in the United States, the federal, state, and even local governments have the power to take property for public use. This is known as the government's power of eminent domain. But as a property owner in the US, just like here in South Africa, with this new law, you and a US citizen both have property rights. So what is Donald and AfriForum on about? The government can't simply take your home and even your land. It must offer you just compensation for your property and prove that it has tried to negotiate, given you fair value for it, and that land is in the interest of the public. Expropriation may and will not be exercised unless the expropriating authority has without success attempted to reach an agreement with the owner of the said land. There are many arbitrators that can come between you and the state, and all of these are available for you to use should you feel that you are being hard done by. The signing of the South African expropriation law comes after a 5-year consultative process, and on top of that, there were findings from a presidential panel that was set up to look into this very issue. The DA is, as they are allowed to, opposing this, and they say that there are technicalities that they deem to be so severe that they are willing to kill the act. The DA says that their challenge to the act is both substantive and procedural and includes but is not limited to 2 key points. 1, they say that the state process of adopting the act did not conform to the Constitution. They say 5 out of 7 provinces that voted on the act in the National Council of Provinces did so without obtaining a provincial mandate in the manner prescribed by the law and regulations. 2, they say that the act is vague and contradictory in several clauses, which they say renders it unconstitutional. It must also be clear that there are no housing property rights that are or will be infringed by this current form of the Act. But if there are, and we're missing it, please send us the page number or even the paragraph from the Act so that we can also scrutinize and learn. Also ask yourself, what exactly is the crux of the disagreement of this particular law? Because the US has the exact same thing written in a very much similar way. The main contention that I can see from the DA and the likes is that in the current Expropriation Act, they reject the ANC's stance of, as they say, trying to smuggle in further powers to expropriate without compensation in an act that is meant to provide for expropriation in circumstances where the state needs to develop infrastructure such as roads, railways, and dams. They say that the ANC is overreaching. They further state that in the passage and in the signature of the Expropriation Act, the ANC wants to dramatically widen the purview of expropriation, and they want to keep the window open for land restitution open indefinitely. Please show us where. The most interesting thing is that even though the DA opposes this, they don't give an alternative as to what we as the public can start to study and weigh up against what is being proposed. Actually, if you think we're missing something here and what South Africa has done is wrong, please explain it to us in the comments. Maybe those who are pro the law are missing something. And in principle, we need new information. This is always welcome. Okay, now that we have that out the way, we need to get to the bigger conversation. South Africa's majority population, Black Africans, own the smallest percentage of the country's private and agricultural land compared to their white counterparts who own almost 3/4. In fact, based off a 2017 land audit that was conducted by the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform, the vivid picture of South Africa and its land starts to become clearer. And maybe the real reason for the current lobbying as well as these efforts starts to become clearer. According to the same land audit of 2017, in South Africa, there are 121 million hectares of land that is available. Now, of that land, roughly 114 million hectares, or 94%, is registered at the deeds office. The outstanding 7 million hectares, or 6%, is unregistered and is in trust state land in the Eastern Cape and in Limpopo. It gets interesting when we look at who owns agricultural land, which I believe is the real crux of this social and political conversation that we're having. And I want us to follow along very, very closely. That same audit also shows that individuals, companies, and trusts own 90% of the 114 million hectares. Individuals own 37 million hectares, or 39% of this total land as a category, followed by trusts at 29 million hectares, or 31%, companies at 23 million, or 25%, CBOs at 3.5 million hectares, or 4%, and co-ownership sits at 883,000 hectares, or 1%. When we look at farms and agricultural holdings, this is where things get sticky. There are 469,000 total agricultural land parcels, around 111 million hectares, or 97% of total agricultural land. This is owned by 588,000 total landowners, or 7% of the population. You could then say 97% of farmland is owned by certain classes of people. But let's keep going. Then, when we look at the racial classifications of the owners of that land, it gets even more interesting. The land audit reveals that whites in South Africa own 26 million hectares, or 72% of the total 37 million hectares of farms and agricultural holdings by individual owners. This is followed by coloreds at 5.3 million hectares, or 15%. Indians are at 2 million hectares, or roughly 5%. Africans sit at a paltry 1.3 million hectares, or 4%. Now, other than that, there's another 1.2 million hectares, or 3%, that is co-owned. No matter how you look at that, that is extremely unequal, especially when you consider that according to available data, which unfortunately isn't that recent, in the year of 2000, the racial breakdown of farm workers in South Africa showed that the majority of agricultural workers were African. 69.7% of all full-time workers identified as being African, followed by coloreds at 21.5%, and white and Indian farmers made up the remaining 10.1%. Then the gender split creates even more of a social conundrum. Individual males own 26 million hectares, or 72% of all the total farms and agricultural holdings owned by individual owners, followed by females at 4.8 million hectares, or 13%. male and female, owned 3.9 million hectares or 11%. Co-owners owned about 2%, and other was at roughly 3%. That's the 2017 picture of land ownership in this country. Now, what often happens is that the report has been very much controversial to groups who feel that they're being misrepresented, but they've often never disputed the data, only mainly how it is interpreted, nor have they offered an alternative study. And again, I ask this, what is it that we're not seeing here? Clarity, again, at this point, is welcome. Also, what is the solution? Don't tell us you're opposed to this. Give us a way out. Let's put our heads together to understand what we could do as a country to get out of this. Now, where land is involved, there is a misconception in South Africa. To be clear to you, what gets many people twisted around this particular land conversation is that the middle class thinks that the government is coming to take your gogo or your um's house, even your flat or even your sectional title. They're not. Relax, breathe. That's so far from the truth, because even 9 years ago, black ownership of South Africa's primary residential market was expected to be at around 60%. This was up from 41.7% in 2009, where white ownership was around 43.8%, colored ownership was at 8.3%, and Indian ownership was at 6.2%. By 2015, black South Africans owned 52% of the value of all houses in South Africa, while whites owned about 35%, with colored and Indian ownership making up the difference. Black South Africans have owned more value in housing stock than whites for a number of years, even if second homes are taken into account. Now, on main dwellings alone, black people own more in property value. According to data from Stats SA, the total household property value in South Africa in 2022 was approximately 6.7 trillion rand, based on the Residential Property Price Index. Stick with me here. No government worth its bloody salt would risk destabilizing a 6.7 trillion rand asset base. Or am I wrong? If I am, show me the data and list your sources. Propaganda is not going to work here. The question of who benefits from pronouncing land reform a failure and your personal private property being at risk needs to be distilled through the lens of who benefits from the racial and social tensions and chaos that will ensue, especially those who want to delay, in my opinion, the conversation and even the question around land in South Africa. Most white people don't even own farms, to be fair. Only a few people actually do. People represented by AfriForum and the likes are the ones who actually gain from this discourse. And they seem to have the ear of Elon and, by extension, the ear of Donald Trump. With there being about an estimated 18 million households now in South Africa, between 38 and 46% of households live in homes that have been built since 1994. Within another generation, black people and those who are marginalized will be able to pass down assets to the next generation. Why would this government risk that? Are they that stupid? This is what they want you to believe. To be even more cynical, go look at the parliamentarians who have at least filed their parliamentary interests and shareholdings. All of them own homes, and predominantly they're black or formerly disadvantaged people. By threatening private property rights in South Africa, they would be threatening their own wealth-generating assets. Now, if there's one thing we know about politicians, they're not in the business of rocking anything that benefits them. We can rest assured there. Now, why am I telling you this? Well, I'm trying to get you to understand that the current uproar around land and property in South Africa is actually an uproar against agricultural land and the ownership thereof. That's what we need to understand about this current furor. Private property ownership is being used as a misdirection tool, a Kansas City shuffle. It's being done in order to get more people behind those who are against the land conversation, when in actual fact, the bigger conversation is the agricultural land, and that actually being more equitably distributed and more indigenous Africans being given an opportunity, and obviously those who want to actually work and prosper on the land. Because to be clear and fair, not every single African wants to be a farmer, just like not every single white person wants to be a farmer as well. But what must be open for both is the ability, should they wish to do so, to be able to do so without there being extra hurdles. This is the main crux of the land question in South Africa. At least it is to me. There have been clear issues and challenges to land redistribution in South Africa. You can actually easily Google any of these cases. Things like corruption and inefficiency in the government programs. These things have contributed to a lot of what we're seeing today and a lot of our reality. Then you add to that there are things like the lack of funding and the lack of resources. Some redistributed farms aren't productive because new owners might not have the training or the capital resources, or they were probably damn cadres. The current debates might involve the amendment of the Constitution to allow expropriation without compensation, which is something that the ANC and the EFF, the MKP, all support. But there's opposition from farmers groups and international observers who are worried around property rights and food security. Also, traditional leaders might have a role to play in this land administration, which could actually further complicate things, but these conversations need to be had. That's why you actually see AfriForum having partnership meetings with the Zulu Kings. Bayete, dog. Don't forget that some land is actually under traditional leadership. A lot actually, especially in areas like KZN and in some parts of the Eastern Cape, which can and will add more conflict and complexity when we look at individual ownership rights. Women's land rights might also be affected by customary laws. All of these things need to be dealt with. It's always been clear that the challenges to land redistribution must and constitutionally will include balancing justice and economic stability. This will include ensuring that land reform doesn't harm agricultural productivity. We need to look at legal complexities in proving and confirming outstanding land claims. We must also deal with social tensions around land and also trust you're doing that just by watching this. Plus, urban land issues like informal settlements and housing shortages must also be addressed in that same conversation. This goes without saying. Land isn't just one thing in particular, but we need to have a dialogue around all the things that affect it. And we need to fix what still needs clarity around all the areas that affect it. There are economic challenges to unpack and also agricultural ones that are a big part of the economy. So if land reform leads to underutilization, it could affect food production and even exports. Also, foreign ownership of land is something that should concern us. In closing, I just want to leave you with this. The history of South African land is rooted in colonial dispossession, apartheid-era laws, and post-apartheid attempts at reform. Attempts that are failing. Our challenge now going forward is to solve this while balancing redress with stability of our economic and social systems. No one wants a Zimbabwe situation. All of this will need renewed government productivity that we need to hold them accountable for. We also need to untangle legal complexities and lastly, political will that must be catalyzed by us, the voters. If those in politics don't get ahead of this, then we will, all of us, have to pick up those pieces. In fact, the new law is merely the start of what needs to happen. This video will undoubtedly have ignited a lot of emotions on both sides of the aisle, between those who have land and those who don't have land. But when you watch this video, we have to agree on one thing, that South Africa has an agricultural land distribution problem. And if it is not solved to include the majority, there will be far-reaching consequences. Maybe not this year or the next, but certainly in the future. Everyone needs to deal with this reality head on. Those who want South Africa to remain the same are not willing to entertain a world where the wrongs that happened in the past are righted through this land question as a start. Dare they get inconvenienced? We all might not like the alternative, less docile reality that might actually ensue, but we need to get ahead of it. Today, for tomorrow. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it was just as interesting for you to watch as it was for us to make for you. Check out one of these other videos and hopefully they'll be just as interesting as this one. Cheers.